The underground facility hummed with the sound of machinery and the faint buzz of fluorescent lights. Hidden deep beneath a mountain range, it was a labyrinth of steel corridors and reinforced chambers, designed to keep its secrets buried from the world above. For Dr. Elena Vega, the facility was both a sanctuary and a prison, a place where she could push the boundaries of science, far from the prying eyes of governments and corporations. But tonight, as she stood in the observation chamber overlooking the portal, she felt a gnawing unease. "Status?" she asked, her voice steady but clipped. "We're stabilizing at 98% containment," said Dr. Malcolm Rice, the lead engineer, his face illuminated by the pale glow of his console. "Readings are holding. If this works..." He didn't finish the sentence, but the excitement in his voice filled the room. Elena stared at the swirling energy field in the center of the chamber. The portal was a jagged oval of light, pulsating like a living thing. Its edges shimmered, throwing erratic shadows across the walls. The first few trials had been disastrous, failed attempts that left scars on the facility and the team. But now it stood open, stable, and tantalizingly close to success. "Let's not get ahead of ourselves," Elena said, turning to her team. "We proceed with the drone. No exceptions." Rice nodded, his enthusiasm tempered by her words. A few keystrokes later, the small insect-like drone on the chamber floor came to life, its rotors spinning up with a faint whine. Elena watched as it hovered, steadied, and then glided into the portal. For a moment, the shimmering surface rippled violently, as if rejecting the intrusion. But then it smoothed over, swallowing the drone whole. The control room went silent, everyone holding their breath as data began to stream in. The drone's camera feed flickered, distorted, and then stabilized, revealing an alien yet eerily familiar landscape. "Is that?" whispered Rice. The screen showed a lush, verdant jungle, the sky a vibrant shade of green. Gigantic trees, their bark glistening as if wet, stretched impossibly high, their canopies alive with strange, fluttering creatures. Pools of water shimmered in the sunlight, reflecting colors no one could name. It was Earth, but not their Earth. "Atmospheric readings?" Elena asked, snapping the team out of their daze. "Breathable," said Dr. Annika Patel, the team's biologist, her fingers flying across her keyboard. "Oxygen levels are slightly elevated, but within human tolerance. No detectable toxins in the air." "Mark this as Earth 1, Elena said. "We'll need samples. Flora, soil, water. Let's..." "Wait," interrupted Rice, pointing at the monitor. The drone's camera panned to the edge of a clearing, where a series of jagged structures jutted out of the ground. They were ruins, half consumed by the jungle, their surfaces etched with intricate patterns. The architecture was alien, yet disturbingly human-like. "Looks like a settlement," Rice said, "but abandoned for centuries, maybe millennia." "Bring the drone back," Elena ordered. Her voice was calm, but her gut churned. Something about the ruins unsettled her, the way they seemed to tilt slightly, as if they were defying gravity, or perhaps obeying laws of physics they couldn't yet understand. The drone complied, weaving its way back through the portal. As it emerged into the chamber, the portal flickered again, this time accompanied by a low, resonant hum. Elena's heart leapt into her throat. "Radiation levels spiking," called out Patel, her voice tinged with panic. "Gamma burst detected." "Shut it down," Elena barked. Rice's fingers flew over his console. The portal collapsed in on itself with a deafening crack, leaving the chamber eerily silent. The drone, now inert on the chamber floor, was coated with a fine layer of what looked like ash. Elena stepped closer to the observation window, her breath fogging the glass. It wasn't ash, it was something organic, pulsating faintly under the chamber's lights. "Quarantine the drone," she said. "Full decontamination protocol. I want samples analyzed immediately." The team moved quickly, the earlier excitement replaced by grim efficiency. Elena remained in the observation chamber, her eyes fixed on the inert machine below. She should have felt triumph. After all, they had opened the portal and glimpsed a parallel Earth. But instead, all she could feel was dread. As she turned to leave, she didn't notice the faint, almost imperceptible movement of the substance on the drone's surface, as if it were alive and waiting. The portal reopened 2 days after the first test, its energy field now steadier, more controlled. The team had worked around the clock, refining the technology and addressing the anomalies from the initial trial. Dr. Elena Vega watched from the observation chamber as the portal shimmered with unnatural light. She couldn't shake the unease that lingered since their first experiment, but there was no turning back now. The stakes were too high. Earth was suffocating under its own weight, and this technology might be their only salvation. "Ready for deployment," said Rice, his voice tight with focus. The second drone, equipped with more advanced sensors and containment protocols, hovered at the portal's threshold. "Proceed," Elena said, her tone flat but firm. The drone slipped through the veil of light. Once again, the surface of the portal rippled like disturbed water before calming. On the monitor, the feed flickered to life. This time, the team saw a barren wasteland. The sky was a sickly yellow, and the ground was cracked and parched, littered with skeletal remains of once mighty cities. Skyscrapers leaned precariously, their frames corroded and crumbling. "Earth 2, Patel whispered, her voice hollow. "No signs of life. No visible contamination either," Rice said, his fingers dancing across his keyboard. "Atmospheric readings indicate a global temperature spike. CO 2 levels off the charts. It's like this Earth boiled itself alive." As the drone ventured deeper, it captured haunting sights: vehicles rusting in the streets, playgrounds overgrown with brittle weeds, and countless human skeletons, their positions frozen in silent testimony to some long-forgotten disaster. Elena clenched her fists. This world was a mirror of their own future, one they were desperately trying to avoid. "Bring it back," Elena ordered. "No samples from this one." Rice complied, and the drone returned without incident. The team barely spoke as they prepared for the next jump. The images of Earth 2 lingered in their minds, a silent warning of what might await their own planet. The third deployment took them to a world blanketed in perpetual twilight. The air shimmered with faint bioluminescence, emitted by a dense, fungal growth that had consumed everything in sight. Trees, buildings, even the ground itself were coated in a pulsating, spore-covered mass. "Earth 3, Patel announced, her voice shaking. "Biological takeover. No signs of complex life, just this Network. The drone's sensors picked up faint electrical impulses coursing through the fungal mat, as if it were a single interconnected organism. Elena's stomach churned as the drone discovered what remained of humanity: twisted, fungus-encrusted figures frozen mid-motion. Some clutched each other in grotesque parodies of comfort, while others were caught mid-run, their faces locked in expressions of terror. "Cut the feed," Elena said abruptly. The image vanished from the screen, replaced by the blank interface of the control panel. She could feel the eyes of her team on her, searching for reassurance she couldn't provide. "We'll regroup," she said after a moment. "Decontamination protocol for the equipment. No samples from this one either." The room remained tense as they prepared for the next mission. No one spoke of what they had seen, but the weight of it hung in the air. The fourth Earth was different. The drone emerged into a bustling city, its architecture sleek and futuristic. The sky was a clear, vibrant blue, and the streets were immaculately clean. At first glance, it seemed like a utopia. "Earth 4, Rice said, his voice tinged with hope. "Finally, a positive outcome." But as the drone continued, it became clear something was wrong. The streets were empty, parks were devoid of children, and buildings showed no signs of habitation. Then the drone's sensors picked up movement. Figures emerged from the shadows, humanoid, but unmistakably wrong. Their skin was gray and stretched taut over their bones, their eyes black pits that reflected no light. They moved in unison, turning as one to face the drone. "Get it out of there," Elena said sharply. Rice initiated the return sequence, but the figures were fast. They swarmed the drone, their movements jerky yet disturbingly coordinated. The feed cut out as the portal roared with energy. Moments later, the drone shot back into the chamber, its frame dented and clawed, the camera lens shattered. "What the hell were those?" Patel whispered. "Not human," Elena said, her voice cold, "and definitely not friendly." As they examined the drone, they found traces of a black, tar-like substance clinging to its surface. Patel ran a preliminary analysis and paled at the results. "It's organic," she said, "and it's still active." Elena ordered an immediate incineration, but the damage was done. The team's confidence was shattered, replaced by a gnawing fear. They had opened a door to horrors they couldn't begin to understand, and with each new Earth, the line between exploration and recklessness blurred further. By the time the fifth deployment began, the team was on edge. Elena could see it in their eyes, the doubt, the fear. Yet they pressed on, driven by equal parts curiosity and desperation. They needed answers, even if it meant risking everything. The portal activated again, its light casting eerie shadows across the chamber. The next Earth awaited, and with it, the unknown. Elena took a deep breath and steadied herself. Whatever lay beyond, they would face it together, or so she told herself. Deep down, she knew the cracks in their resolve were already beginning to show. The first signs of infection went unnoticed, a faint sheen of spores clinging to the lab's ventilation system, a strange dampness that no one thought to question. By the time Dr. Annika Patel noticed the black discoloration spreading across the quarantine chamber walls, it was already too late. "It's alive," she whispered, her voice trembling as she studied the writhing, tar-like substance under the microscope. The organism from Earth 4 was adapting, multiplying with alarming speed. It didn't just grow, it evolved, its cells mutating to match the chemical composition of its surroundings. Elena Vega stood over her shoulder, her jaw tight. Shut down the lab, full containment protocol. Patel turned to her, fear etched into her face. It won't be enough. This thing, it's designed to spread. The alarms began blaring moments later. In the observation chamber, a low guttural sound emanated from the quarantine cell where the infected drone had been stored. Rice and another technician were already there, staring in horror at the thick, undulating mass that now coated the walls, ceiling, and floor. It pulsed rhythmically, like the beat of a heart, and deep within it, something was moving. "What the hell is that?" Rice whispered, his voice barely audible over the blaring alarms. Before anyone could respond, the glass of the quarantine chamber cracked. A hairline fracture at first, then a spiderweb of breaks spreading across the reinforced barrier. "Get out!" Elena shouted, but the crack became a shatter and the organism burst into the observation room in a wave of black ichor. The team scattered. Rice and the technician weren't fast enough. The ichor engulfed them, and their screams echoed through the facility as their bodies convulsed, twisting unnaturally. Elena and Patel watched in horror as the black mass seemed to seep into their skin, forcing their limbs into impossible angles. When the screaming stopped, what was left of them was no longer human. Their heads tilted unnaturally, their mouths split open in silent howls, and their skins stretched taut over alien growths. "We need to seal this level," Elena said, grabbing Patel's arm and pulling her away. "Now." In the control room, Elena ordered an immediate lockdown. Steel barriers slammed into place, isolating the infected level. But the damage had already spread. The ventilation system was compromised, carrying spores to other parts of the facility. One by one, members of the team began to exhibit symptoms, fevers, hallucinations, and eventually, the telltale black veins crawling beneath their skin. Patel worked furiously in the medical lab, dissecting a sample of the organism they'd managed to isolate. "It's not just a parasite," she said, her voice ragged. "It's something else. It doesn't just feed, it rewrites the host. It's using their memories, their biology, to create hybrids." Elena clenched her fists. "How do we stop it?" Patel shook her head. "I don't know if we can. Every time we attack it, heat, chemicals, radiation, it adapts. It's like it's learning from us." The infected began to move in ways that suggested more than mindless aggression. They coordinated, appearing to stalk the uninfected in the shadowy corridors. Elena and the few remaining survivors barricaded themselves in the main control room, armed with whatever weapons they could find. "They're waiting," Rice said, his voice hoarse. He'd been injured during the breach, but insisted on helping. His eyes flicked nervously between the sealed doors. "They know we're here." "That's impossible," Elena said, but even as she spoke, she felt the creeping dread of doubt. The infected were no longer mindless. They were deliberate. She had seen it in their eyes, those black, reflective pits that seemed to watch and calculate. "We can't stay here," Patel said. "The spores are everywhere. If we wait, we'll end up like them." Elena nodded. We need to destroy the portal. If we can collapse the field, maybe we can cut off the connection to whatever's driving this thing. The plan was desperate. The energy core that powered the portal could be overloaded, creating an explosion that would vaporize the organism and the infected. But it was a one-way trip. Someone would have to stay behind to trigger it manually. "I'll do it," Elena said without hesitation. "No," Patel said. "You're the only one who can get out of here alive. You're the only one who can warn the world." Before Elena could argue, the doors to the control room buckled. The infected were outside, pounding against the steel, their distorted voices echoing through the chamber. "It's now or never," Patel said, shoving a data drive into Elena's hand. "Go. This has everything we've learned. The world needs to know." Elena hesitated for a fraction of a second, then turned and ran. Behind her, Patel sealed the control room. Through the thick glass, Elena saw her former colleague turn to face the door, scalpel in hand, as the infected broke through. The final stretch to the portal chamber was a blur. The facility was unrecognizable, its walls coated in black growths that pulsed like veins. The infected pursued her relentlessly, their distorted forms skittering through the corridors like grotesque insects. When Elena reached the portal chamber, she set the core to overload. The room vibrated with the escalating hum of the energy field. She keyed in the final sequence, her hands shaking as the infected swarmed into the chamber. She fought them off as best she could, but she was outnumbered. One of them grabbed her arm, its blackened claws digging into her skin. She screamed as she felt the infection spreading, the veins on her arm turning black in seconds. With the last of her strength, she slammed the final button. The core detonated. The explosion was a blinding flash of light, consuming everything in its path. And then there was silence. The sky above the facility burned with an unnatural light, a kaleidoscope of colors that rippled and pulsed like the surface of an open wound. Elena Vega staggered through the wreckage, her body battered, her left arm swathed in hastily applied bandages. The infection hadn't spread further, for now, but the blackened veins creeping under her skin told her it was only a matter of time. The blast had obliterated the facility and severed the portal, but she knew the truth. The organism was far from gone. The world she emerged into felt alien in its stillness. Snow, tinged with faint streaks of black, fell in eerie silence, covering the jagged remnants of the mountain that once hid their work. Elena's breath fogged in the freezing air as she climbed the ridge, each step heavy with exhaustion. Behind her, the charred landscape smoldered, a graveyard for her team, her ambition, and perhaps humanity's last hope. She reached the summit and collapsed to her knees, her hands trembling as she pulled the data drive from her pocket. Everything they'd learned, everything they'd seen, was contained in that fragile piece of technology. If she could get it to the right people, maybe, just maybe, it would be enough to warn the world, to prepare for the organism's spread. But as she looked out over the horizon, she saw the truth laid bare. The clouds weren't clouds anymore. They shimmered with the same bioluminescent glow they'd seen on Earth. 3 faint tendrils of light stretching and twisting like veins in a living organism. The air tasted different, laced with an acrid bitterness that burned her throat. Her breath caught as she noticed the faint glow in the snow around her, tiny spores dancing in the cold wind. She wasn't the only one who had survived. Elena's mind raced. The spores had escaped during the breach. The organism had been carried on the wind through the facility's broken seals into the world beyond. It was too late to stop it. Even if she found someone to warn, there was no containing what had already begun. A rustling sound broke her thoughts. She turned sharply, the motion sending a spike of pain through her infected arm. At the edge of the ridge, a figure emerged from the haze. Its movements were jerky, its head tilting unnaturally as it stepped closer. The faint glow of the organism coursed beneath its skin, illuminating grotesque growths that twisted and bulged from its once human frame. More figures followed, their shapes barely recognizable. Some crawled on all fours, their limbs elongated and warped. Others walked upright but moved as if dragged by unseen strings. They stopped at the edge of the ridge, staring at her with those hollow black eyes. Their mouths twitched, and for a moment Elena thought she heard whispers, faint echoes of voices she recognized. Rice, Patel, the others. They weren't just infected. They remembered. "Stay back," Elena said, her voice cracking as she fumbled for the pistol at her side. Her hands shook as she aimed at the nearest figure. It took another step forward, its head cocked as if studying her. "I said stay back," she screamed, pulling the trigger. The gunshot echoed across the mountains, and the figure dropped. The others didn't flinch. They just watched, silent and unblinking, as the one she'd shot began to rise again, its movements sluggish but inevitable. The wound in its chest closed before her eyes, the organism knitting flesh and bone back together in seconds. Elena's breaths came in ragged gasps. She knew she couldn't fight them, couldn't outrun them. The pistol fell from her hands as the reality sank in. This wasn't just an infection. It was evolution, a new apex predator that would consume everything in its path. She clutched the data drive tightly, tears streaming down her face. "I'm sorry," she whispered, though she didn't know if she was speaking to her team, to herself, or to the world she'd failed to save. The infected began to move again, closing the distance between them and her. Their whispers grew louder, more insistent. She thought she heard her name, distorted and hollow, carried on the wind. Elena stumbled to her feet, her legs weak but driven by a desperate resolve. If she couldn't save the world, she could at least leave a warning. She turned and began to run, her breath hitching with every step. The snow churned under her boots as she fled down the ridge, the figures following in eerie silence. She didn't look back. She couldn't. The whispers grew louder, closer, until they weren't whispers anymore, but a chorus of voices, all calling her name. Elena. Her foot caught on a jagged rock and she fell hard, the impact jarring the data drive from her grip. It skittered across the snow, coming to rest at the edge of a dark crevasse. She crawled toward it, ignoring the pain, her blood staining the snow behind her. She reached out, her fingers brushing the drive, just as a shadow loomed over her. The last thing she saw was the reflection of her own face in those black, featureless eyes. When the rescue team arrived weeks later, they found nothing but ash and snow. The data drive was recovered from the crevasse, its casing cracked but intact. No one knew what had happened at the facility, but the lead investigator noted strange anomalies in the environment, plants with faint bioluminescence, a black fungus spreading along the mountain's base. The data drive was sent to a classified lab for analysis. What it contained would remain a closely guarded secret, buried beneath layers of bureaucracy. By the time the first reports of sickness emerged in nearby towns, it was already too late. Far above the mountain, the clouds continued to glow, their tendrils reaching further across the sky. Humanity's time was over. Something else had taken its place.